Hello, and welcome to the first episode of Reuters Events Zeroing In, a new series designed to explore the big topics and debates as we move through the energy transition. My name is Owen Robb. I head up the energy transition team here at Reuters Events, and I'll be your chair today. Thank you to all of you joining us, and everyone also now listening on demand. This first episode will explore climate strategy and leadership for the coming decade. The past year has seen a threefold increase in companies publicly pursuing net zero ambitions. Whilst companies set these net zero goals, the importance of incremental gains should, however, not be underestimated. How can we ensure balance between these objectives? What role will COP26 and the wider policy and regulatory framework play? And how can companies demonstrate both leadership and action? Joining me to explore these themes today, I have the pleasure of introducing Michael Lewis, Chief Executive Officer at E.ON UK, Emily Reichardt, Chief Executive Officer at Greentown Labs, and Chris Fallon, President of Duke Energy Renewables. Thank you all for joining us. As ever, before we begin, a final reminder that this is very much an interactive session. So you do have the facility to ask questions as we move through the Q&A function. Do get those coming in and we'll see how many of those we can get to as we move through. Without further ado, Michael, I'd like to come to you first. Thanks for joining us. And for those less familiar, can you start by talking to us a little bit more around your kind of unique approach to decarbonisation at E.ON in the UK, particularly with regard to the great progress you've made on electrification and energy efficiencies?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Owen. Maybe just for the benefit of those viewers who don't know about E.ON, we're one of the largest European utilities, and we're focused very much on the downstream energy transition. We were previously, going back a few years, one of the largest integrated utilities. We have increasingly focused, driven largely by our desire to ensure that we deliver zero carbon on a smaller element of the value chain, namely customers and networks, which we see as absolutely critical for delivering zero carbon. And we are, in fact, the largest energy supplier, customer and networks company in Europe. As far as the UK is concerned, our focus is very much on taking our customers through the energy transition. If you think about what the transition means, it's often characterized as simply decarbonising electricity with lots of renewables, and that certainly is a very, very significant part of it. But that's not all. It's also about decarbonising heating, in other words, getting natural gas out of heating, and decarbonising transport through removing petroleum from the energy ecosystem. So what does that mean? It means not only greening electricity, it means a massive expansion in electricity production and a commensurate reduction in those other forms of energy. In turn, that means not only changing demand for electricity, but a change in the profile of electricity consumption, and indeed a change in the role of the customer from passive to active. And those are all of the elements that we are helping the customer to navigate. So we have three elements to our strategy. Number one is energy efficiency. That's absolutely at the heart, and in fact is a prerequisite for delivering the energy transition. If we don't make better use of the energy we currently produce and the energy we will produce in the future, we won't be able to make the switch, for instance, to electric heat pumps, because you need energy efficient homes for them to work properly. So energy efficiency is absolutely key, making better use of the energy we already produce and consume. And in the UK alone, we need to upgrade around 19 million homes in order to deliver the energy transition. Second element is smart energy. If we're going to adapt to a system which is two-way, in the sense that consumers are both producing and using energy, we need a smart system which can use the information that they're producing about their profile of demand. So we're rolling out smart meters to every customer, and we're giving them the necessary devices. And with new software we're investing in, we can be much more targeted with the types of tariffs we offer. For instance, for people with electric vehicles, time-based tariffs, which can take advantage of volatility in electricity prices as renewables becomes a bigger part of production. So it's those are the first two elements. The third thing is the electrification of homes. Now, of course, homes are already electrified, but what I mean by that is the electrification of heating through a move to heat pumps, and indeed production of energy in the home. So that's solar PV and battery. So solar on the roof, batteries in the garage or in the cellar, so that customers themselves can become proactive. And if you think about it like this, if you move to an electric vehicle, they have a roughly 70 to 90 kilowatt hour battery, a fully electric vehicle. That's roughly, if you were to have 30 million EVs on the road, that's 30 million private vehicles we have in the UK, that's roughly 3 days storage of current UK electricity consumption. So it's a huge amount of storage you're building up, which will be necessary to operate the system. I think the final point is, which maybe we'll come on to, is the role of hydrogen in the energy transition, which again we think is very, very important, and which we need to look at how we use hydrogen as the seasonal storage vector. So those are the key elements of our energy transition. We're investing in all of those, and I have to say we're right at the beginning of it now. We've completely adjusted our corporate portfolio of businesses, and now it's about competing hard in delivering that vision. Thank you,
Michael. I'm sure, yeah, efficiency, smart energy, electrification, and hydrogen for sure will be coming back to some of those themes. But at this point, Emily, it would be brilliant to bring you in. Obviously, congratulations on the progress update that we saw from your new Houston incubator just last week. Can you tell us a little bit more around the work being done by Greentown Labs and what role can you play within this low carbon energy system?
Well, I'd be happy to, and thank you for having me. Let me tell you a little bit about Greentown Labs, and then I'll roll into a bit about the expansion and what we're hoping to accomplish in the energy capital of the world, Houston, Texas. So Greentown Labs is the largest climate tech incubator in North America, and we are home to about 100 early stage companies who are tackling challenges really across the largest greenhouse gas emitting sectors. So those range from electricity, certainly, but also buildings, transportation, agriculture, and manufacturing. Our mission is to provide these startups with the community, the resources, the connections that they need in order to thrive. And we don't take equity in our companies. We are a mission-based organization. So our win is when we see the technology getting out into the world where it can have an impact on climate change. Since our founding, we've supported more than 300 companies who have collectively raised more than $1.2 billion in additional follow-on capital, and they have also created 6,500 jobs. We have an 88% success rate, which means our companies continue to grow and thrive after they leave the Greentown Labs campus. Our headquarters in Boston area spans 100,000 square feet, and that's comprised of prototyping labs, wet chemistry labs, office, and community space, and is currently home to about 100 companies who are addressing climate change through technology entrepreneurship. Now, back in June of 2020, we announced our first ever expansion out of state to Houston, Texas, the energy capital of the world. And that really needs to be the energy transition capital of the world if we are going to address climate change on the time scale we need to. So the expansion in Houston is really about expanding our national reach beyond the US coast, and it's about impact in order to meet the urgent challenge of climate change. And we believe that opening a second location in the energy capital of the world, we can help to accelerate the energy transition by supporting and frankly spotlighting climate tech entrepreneurship in partnership with the nation's 4th largest city and the world leading energy organizations that are headquartered there. So Greentown Houston will be about 40,000 square feet and provides space for about 50 early stage companies. And we have now already signed on 20 of those prior to even opening our physical doors, which happens later this spring. And we're about at the midpoint of our construction project with the plan to soft open around April 1st. So how do we think about our role in the energy transition? Well, speaking in the Houston context, we really aim for Greentown Houston to be a place for convening climate tech startups, investors, corporate partners, students, and other stakeholders that are working together or need to work together on decarbonizing our economy. And Greentown Labs Houston will be the first climate tech focused incubator in the city with the goal and a mission to do that. In general, working with corporate partners is not a new thing for Greentown Labs. It's really part of our DNA. And at Greentown, we've worked with dozens of forward-thinking corporations for many years, more than 50 of them. These companies have announced bold science-based climate goals and are actively engaging startups in the climate tech space. And in our experience, corporate partnerships are really paramount to the success of these early stage climate tech startups. The reason is that they are absolutely a necessary partner to scale technology to the point where it can have an impact as quickly as possible. And we see these partners become investors, first customers, provide pilot sites, helping our startups go further faster. At the same time, many corporations are seeking external innovation as they position themselves to meet those long-term net zero goals and short-term sustainability goals that you mentioned at the outset, Owen. So we really see our role as one of convener, catalyst, and accelerator for energy transition needs around innovation. We bring folks together who are focused on the technical solutions to the problem. And it's a role that we're proud to play in Houston, as we have in Boston for many years.
Thanks, Emily. Sounds like a super interesting and exciting place to be. Chris, to bring you into the conversation as well, we've heard Michael and Emily talk around kind of their role and the importance of customers and the companies they work with within that. How does Duke Energy Renewables fit into the Duke Energy family, and kind of how are you specifically looking to kind of help other companies achieve their climate goals whilst delivering on your own?
All right. Thanks, Owen, and thanks for having me today. I'll give you a little bit of background on Duke Energy, and I think Duke Energy's important role in this energy transition, and then also then specifically talk about Duke Energy Renewables. So just to set the stage, Duke Energy is one of the largest electric holding utility companies in the United States. We serve 7.7 million customers in 6 states on the electricity side. We also have a natural gas distribution business that serves 1.6 million customers in 4 states. And then, and so we own and operate over 51,000 megawatts of generation to serve these customers. And then on the Duke Energy Renewables side, we have 4.3 gigawatts of wind, solar, and storage assets in 21 wind sites, 150 solar sites, and 2 battery storage sites in 21 states across the U.S. So we have a very large footprint, and I think, where do we fit into this energy transition? And so I'll start with the Duke Energy component, right? We have 7.7 million customers, right? We serve 6 states, and Duke Energy is an incredibly important part of that state in terms of economic development, making sure that our customers are getting green, sustainable, low cost, and reliable energy, right? And I think this transition and some of the things that we've seen this past 8 or 9 months from, California had rolling blackouts this summer, Texas is having during these extreme weather events, right? A company like Duke, who has those customers, and we're so critical to the infrastructure of the states that we serve. I mean, this transition is critically important, not just to our customers, but to all of our stakeholders, which includes the state and the economies that we serve. So I think we have to get this right. And so Duke has got a very ambitious goal that we are going to reduce our carbon footprint by 50% off of 2005 levels to 50% by 2030, and then net zero carbon by 2050. In 2020, we crossed the milestone where we have reduced our carbon emissions by 40% off of that 2005 value. So we are making great progress towards that. And I think this transition is key because we need to make sure that our customers, right, can come along and be part of that transition, right? And we have to serve a lot of different stakeholders. So we are doing a lot of work in our states and through our utilities to work with all our customers to help them meet their goals, with sustainability goals and the affordability and cost effectiveness goals. And then on the Duke Energy Renewable side, we're working with customers outside of the regulated service footprint all over the United States to help them meet their sustainability goals. So we work with customers, we find out what their desires are, and then we tailor a solution to meet them, whether that is a virtual PPA to meet their renewable energy goals, or an on-site solar or energy efficiency programs, right? So we're working with customers across the value chain in order to help them meet their sustainability goals. And so, Duke, we're working towards those very aggressive goals by 2030. And then just the final thing I'll mention is that even on our natural gas distribution utilities, we have a net zero methane goal by 2030. So this is looking at the whole value chain to customers, looking at all of the assets and the emissions that impact them.
That's great. Thanks, Chris, and a really great way to set the scene as well. We've already got great questions coming in, and we will bring them in as we move through. But really, to open this conversation up now, it's great to hear that everyone on the line here really has some much more kind of tangible and short-term objectives as part of their kind of your energy transition strategies. But how do we, when we look at this balance between these longer-term objectives and the need for real kind of tangible short-term action, how do we ensure we get that balance right? And what can leaders like yourselves do to ensure both action in the short term whilst keeping a line of sight on those 2030 or 2050 targets? Michael, perhaps I'll come to you first.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think we have to draw a distinction between those things which make sense in themselves and those things which will require, at least in the short term, some stimulus from government or even global policy implemented by governments, through the COP process. For example, energy efficiency, it's one of those things that's been talked about for a long, long time, certainly in the UK context, but we've never been very effective at making it happen. But this is, as someone once described it, as it's not low-hanging fruit, it's fruit that's fallen onto the ground and is just waiting to be picked up. It makes perfect economic sense to do it regardless of the energy transition. We just need to figure out the right policies to make it happen. And the problem is you have to pay up front for benefits over a long period of time, and the benefits are distributed. Primary benefit comes to the owner of the property or the tenant of the property, because of course they get lower energy bills, but there are other benefits in terms of lower emissions, both CO2 and indeed local air pollution, which deliver additional benefits, and a more healthy population, which delivers low health costs. So that is a policy which simply needs to be done regardless. Short term, long term, it just makes sense, and we should do it. If you look at longer term things like hydrogen, for instance, yes, we know that technically that is a solution for storage, but economically it's not yet in the right place where it can do it efficiently. So we need a long term policy framework to drive up the scale and drive down the costs, not unlike what we did for wind. If I go back 15 years when I started working in the wind area, onshore wind, offshore wind and solar were much higher cost than fossil fuels. Levelized cost of energy for offshore was probably 4 times that of a new CCGT, and solar was 5 times, and onshore wind maybe 3 times. Probably a bit less in the US, but at least in Europe was that because of the lower load factors. But different governments put frameworks in place to drive long-term action so that the supply chains could build up, companies like ourselves could invest, and Duke, and we were able to drive down the level of levelized cost of energy to now where the point you would build it anyway. And we need to do the same for other technologies that will play a role in the transition, hydrogen, for instance, and that's where green tech innovators and incubators are absolutely central to that. And I'm absolutely convinced that there's no contradiction between the short-term action we have to take now and delivering that long-term goal. But I think there are a few structural points in the way. Chris talked about gas grids. If we're going to switch to hydrogen, at what point do you flip over from natural gas to hydrogen? That's a kind of central system decision that has to be made, and not one that individual companies can make. So we have to understand when those milestones are and prepare for them. But I think there is no contradiction between taking short-term action on energy efficiency, on smart meters and so on, and continuing to invest in renewables and driving those long-term aims.
So, Owen, this is, I think I agree with Michael. I think one of the things I'd like to add is the fact that I don't believe that there is a conflict between the long-term and short-term, but I think in order to do it most effectively, we need certainty, right? And I think we need to make sure that we know what the end is, and then we can work on the short term with that end in mind, right? And I think that, I said in my opening that I think Duke plays an incredibly important role in this energy transition because we serve 7.7 million customers in 6 different states, right? And 6 different states have 6 different legacy power systems that are all in different components, right? In the Carolinas, I had more than 50% of my energy from a zero carbon nuclear assets, whereas in Indiana, I get a majority of my energy from legacy coal assets, right? The transition plan for those 2 states and jurisdictions are going to be significantly different, right? And so, in the short term, Duke, we have some goals to, double our renewable footprint by 2025 and triple it by 2030, right? So that's getting us towards that 50% reduction by 2030. And I think in the meantime, we need to make sure that we're developing storage, right? Storage is a critical component. When given what happened with the pandemic and the load reductions, when I look at my daily reports on where my generation assets are doing at my in my commercial business, the amount of curtailment that has occurred, right? Because you have more renewable generation that's not dispatchable, and load is reduced due to things, right? So that's just wasted energy, right? So I think that having the system, knowing where you're going, and designing the system so that you can maximize the value and the efficiency of these renewables is critically important. Because at the end of the day, in order for this transition to be successful, you've got to meet most or all of your stakeholders' desires. And a lot of them have desires of affordability. So we have to do it in the most cost-effective manner with that end in mind of getting to zero carbon by 2050. So I think it's a combination of certainty and then making sure that we can tailor the solutions based upon the individual needs, and it's not a one-size-fits-all.
Thanks, Chris. Emily, anything that you would add on that point there? We've talked a lot around kind of that efficiency piece and that certainty piece, but potentially no conflict between the two. From your view and with the companies that you work with, how are you seeing this balance between objectives play out? Just on mute there, I think, Emily.
I think I would like to think about this in terms of how we take some of the big goals that we've set, and we have many partners who have set them, and think about how we turn those into action in the short term, just as my colleagues here have talked about. So we work with a lot of partners who have really announced very ambitious climate goals. Carbon neutrality by 2050, those include Unilever, BASF, Chevron, Enel, Engie, Shell, Toray Industries, National Grid, Microsoft, and some have certainly announced shorter term goals. Microsoft's commitments include carbon negative by 2030 and removing its historical carbon emissions by 2050. And they are, I think, in this day or are within the last couple of weeks, launching $1 billion climate innovation fund. I think, how do you turn the talk into action? I think that there are 3 things that are very important in doing that. And the first is really leadership. It's setting expectations about change and getting everyone on board. And this needs to happen in the boardrooms of America. It needs to happen with shareholders. And frankly, it needs to happen with frontline employees. Everyone needs to be brought along with what needs to happen. Secondly, I think embracing open innovation. We need to invest in the people, the R&D, strategic venture capital, partnerships, and realize that voices that have not traditionally been at the table are going to add new perspectives and creativity to help us address this challenge. And thirdly, we got to make it real. This latest generation of employees, Gen Z and millennials, aren't going to wait around too long, and neither is the climate. And so investing real dollars, cultivating meaningful relationships and partnerships. The time for talk, as I was hearing in Houston when I was there last week, is really over. This stuff is hard, it takes time, and we need to start building these relationships that are going to move us forward and recognize we're all in the same boat. We got to figure this out together. And witnessing in Houston just how fast the energy transition is moving there, I think it's an exciting time to be in this industry. And I hope that all of us will realize that we can do more together than we can do individually as companies, as startups. There's a lot to think about in terms of partnerships and innovation.
Oh, thanks, Emily. I think there's some questions coming in around those policy pieces that we also began to mention. I think Michael was discussing, but before we move on to that, we've discussed efficiency as well as kind of that kind of low-hanging fruit or fruit already on the floor. Are there any other easy wins you could say when we look at that short term and really turning the dial and getting that rapid action and improvement that we need in terms of emissions, etc.? Are there any other easy wins or anything that we don't think the industry is exploiting enough in order to drive down emissions and drive towards those net zero or low carbon goals that we have in place?
And maybe I jump in here.
Sure.
I don't see any very obvious things, because I think at least most countries, or most countries in the developed world, and we can talk about what it means for the rest of the world, but in Europe and the US, for instance, most of the policies, one way or another, that will deliver the short-term wins are in place. Massive expansion of renewables. You can argue about whether they've got the best policy in place, but I think the fundamental policies are in place. I think one thing I would say, though, and this comes back to this conflict between short and long term, is it is really important that the costs of the upfront investment are seen to be equitable to society. And it's interesting, if you look at what happened in the US versus Europe, most European countries have put the upfront costs of subsidizing renewables into the electricity price, which is pretty regressive. Effectively a regressive tax. In the US, through the production tax credit, it's been put into the general taxation system. And in fact, the German government is now thinking about whether they should move some of the costs of the Erneuerbare Energiegesetz, the subsidy for renewables, into general taxation and out of the electricity price, because it is regressive. So I think governments have to think really hard about how the costs are spread initially. I've said, energy efficiency and renewables, they are long-term deflationary. They lower the cost of energy, but in the short term, you need to invest, and we need to ensure that those costs are spread equitably, so that the energy transition is not seen as something that is imposing costs on people who can't afford to pay them. That is critical about how policies are designed, and I think in a sense, a quick win is making sure that policy is smart as well as driving in the right direction.
Thanks. Michael, there's a question actually on that's come in for Emily specifically, and I think it makes sense to bring that in here as well. When it comes to these investments then, and you talk about those kind of wide array of partners that you work with, in hand with Michael's point around the kind of need for equity in how we distribute those costs, where should the investment come from? Who should the investment come from? And do you see it as a collaborative process, or are there any particular groups that you should be targeting more?
So my main focus is on the investment in innovation. And so when you think about innovation, there are a variety of different roles. There is probably a government investment that happens with the upfront prior to the point at which technology gets to be de-risked, at which point it can be invested in by the private sector. And so you have really what is, I'd say, kind of a continuum of investment opportunities for a variety of different stakeholders. I think the important thing, though, is to pull back and realize that this is the direction the world is going. The energy transition, is well underway. So these are smart investments to be making. When you look at solar and wind and how the costs have come down so much in a mere 10-year period, when you look at where energy storage is, these are investments that the private sector is going to be very glad that they made if they get in early on. And it is investment that creates jobs and well-being and livelihoods that can support families, livelihoods in terms of salaries that can support families over the long term without the ups and downs associated with oil and gas boom and bust. So I think when you think about an investment, there's a lot of potential investors. There are a lot of folks that have the opportunity to benefit from making these investments. But I'd say the public sector and the private sector both have a very important role to play here.
Sure. Yeah, no, thanks for that. And yeah, I think we'll move on to some more conversations now around those kind of policy frameworks and the role of that kind of public-private relationship. Before we move to that, there's a couple of questions coming in, already about COP26, and it's going to undoubtedly dominate a lot of the conversations that we have this year, and rightly too. Just how important do you think COP will be in the kind of progress of this energy transition? And the question asks here, what do you see as the kind of biggest barrier or inertia that we're currently experiencing that COP could be used to accelerate or overcome? Chris, perhaps firstly, we'll come to you.
Well, what could it, I think, so looking at I'll just go, Duke supports the U.S., rejoining the Paris Accord and setting the country's goals to reduce emissions and, having that done across all sectors of the economy, right? You don't want to have this hit just one sector of the economy, like put a disproportionate impact on that. But I think in general, having that goal, right? Having that goal that everyone, so that industries don't feel like they're disadvantaged. So someone in the United States, that we're somehow having higher energy prices because we've made this transition versus, a competitor in another country. So having that alignment, I think, will be key to getting the support necessary to move it forward, right? Because again, I go back to, if we have certainty, if we have the support, it's going to be a much smoother and more cost-effective economic rollout if we can do that. So getting that alignment so that we're all marching in the same direction, I think will be critical for advancing this transition. If there's all this finger pointing and fighting, I think that just undermines the commitment of all the stakeholders and will slow the process down.
Thanks, Chris. Michael or Emily, anything to add on that point when we kind of look at COP and the run up to November?
And maybe from my side, I think COP is really, really important. It's essential we have a global framework in place to drive the energy transition. And you might say, well, you've just said earlier that a lot of this policy and a lot of the things we need to do to drive the energy transition make economic sense. So why do you need a treaty to do it if it makes economic sense anyway? I think the key point is that the transition does entail some important challenges to be addressed, which, even though long-term it makes economic sense, there are short-term challenges. And I've already mentioned a couple of them, but if you think about what the energy transition has required in the countries that have stepped down that route, mostly developing countries so far, first of all, it means that some of the assets that we already have need to be retired early. So there is an impairment cost for existing infrastructure. Now, developing countries can maybe miss some of that because they haven't invested in to the extent that developed countries have in a fossil-based infrastructure. Nonetheless, there is an element of restructuring which will require impairment of existing assets. Secondly, the upfront costs still need to be paid for, and that is the big challenge. Although, as I've said, renewables and the energy transition is deflationary from an energy cost perspective, it's different from fossil fuels in that a lot of the cost of renewables is upfront. So it's a high capital cost, low marginal cost compared to fossil fuels, which are lower capital costs and higher marginal costs. So we have to figure out how to make that investment, and that's why a long-term treaty is required. And of course, new technologies don't exist for some of the things we need to do. We've talked about hydrogen and storage, and I'm sure that there are numerous other areas where we need new technologies to make the transition work at the real detailed granular level of individual consumers. And we need a framework in place to ensure that people have that long-term perspective and can invest in those technologies and wait 15, 20 years to get the returns on it. So that's why we need it. Yes, much of it makes economic sense anyway, and countries will be doing it anyway and are, but there are many elements which need that global framework to make it happen and to make sure the transition is equitable.
Sure. And Emily, if we perhaps even take a step back from COP specifically and look at the role of government, or more broadly the public sector within this leadership conversation, what do you see as the role for the public sector in working with the private sector in ensuring leadership? Where should that come from, and how does that relationship work most effectively, do you feel?
I think the government's role in this conversation really is in a couple of different parts. So first and foremost, it's a market signal. It's a strong market signal. Certainly regulations and frameworks can facilitate markets. You look at EV charging stations. In the US, it's a mishmash of utilities doing it. Some municipalities are doing it. Are the car companies eventually? Oh, whoops, Tesla is also creating charging stations. So sometimes government can play the role of facilitating markets and making them work more efficiently. And I think that is something that we really need in this industry in order to move as fast as possible. Certainly there's the international coordination piece and support for innovation as well that are sending important market signals. The second thing I think is the government can play a role because it has the bully pulpit, the convening power, bringing all the players to the table. It really does what Greentown does on a small scale to tackle a massive problem that has no state or local or federal boundaries. You need a player that can pull everyone together, and I think that's why COP26 and meetings like it are so important. And there needs to be really collaboration between all levels of government in order to get this done, and so that convening power is really critical. And then finally, I think government has the role of equity, helping those who have been traditionally left behind to be part of the clean energy revolution that is before us. So resilience, adaptation strategies, fixing infrastructure or updating infrastructure for those who are already being affected by climate change or will be affected, that's really got to come from government because it is kind of the last resort supporter of many folks who are going to be affected by this transition, whether it is needing to be retrained for new jobs or needing to have their homes and businesses protected. There's definitely a role for the government there as well.
Thanks, Emily. I think we've talked now around kind of the general kind of leadership points and looked at that government piece. Something we've touched on as we've moved through is obviously the technology and the innovations that are going to get us here. Maybe to start on that kind of technology conversation, the hydrogen piece we know is becoming increasingly kind of talked about in the space. There's a question that's come in asking, really it's asking about the colours of hydrogen and saying, the grey hydrogen at the moment is obviously the cheapest source. The question asked, but I'm happy to open it out wider than that. Will hydrocarbons continue to be part of the of the kind of zero carbon future as it relates to hydrogen? Or should we be pushing, and how should we be pushing towards green and blue colours of hydrogen?
I'm happy to jump in there. I mean, my own My own view is that I think we should be looking to move to 100% green hydrogen. We know we can produce electricity at increasingly low prices from renewable energy, and we know that we need hydrogen as a storage factor. So we should actually see hydrogen not as a source of energy, but as a store of energy. And it's a store of low-cost renewable electricity. That's how I would characterize it. So whilst other colors of hydrogen may have an important role to play in the transition, ultimately we should be aiming to get off hydrocarbon fuels and onto a system which is 100% renewable energy with hydrogen as the storage factor. And that means a long-term policy framework to get there. It also means lots of innovation and companies trying different ways of bringing that cost down. And I think as the levelized cost of energy for renewables continues to fall and hydrogen electrolysis is scaled up, we will see the cost per unit of hydrogen coming down significantly and becoming competitive over time. You know, it's exactly what we saw with other parts of the energy transition in solar and wind.
Yeah, and I'd say I'd just give an example. Right before my very eyes, one of our companies at Greentown Labs is called Ivis Energy Solutions, and they create what they call a hydrogen refueling appliance, a hydrogen charging station for vehicles and other machinery, such as forklifts. This solution, I can't even tell you the demand that this company is seeing. And they have only been around a couple of years, and they have more orders than they can possibly fill. And it's really all about on-site hydrogen generation and dispensing this using water and electricity to do it. So high purity, fuel cell grade hydrogen, the green hydrogen that we're all aiming for. So this is a small scale example, but I think it really emphasizes the fact that we can do this if we are willing to invest in it and push it forward. And so yes, we should absolutely be moving from gray to blue to green. It will take upfront investment, absolutely, but you have to think also about all of those pipelines and that infrastructure and those assets that we've already built and invested in that could be reutilized for the transfer movement of hydrogen. There's many, many jobs that are involved in that. There's a lot of investment that has already been sunk. So how do we think about moving these things forward? And let's step back and see the entire picture for what it is. And that is, we've already made a lot of investment. Now we just need to push forward in a direction that makes sense for our planet, makes sense for the people on it, and makes sense for the investment that we have already made to be fully utilized and not become stranded.
Thanks, Emily. And Chris, from a Duke Energy renewables perspective, how do you see the kind of evolving market for hydrogen and kind of what's the role that you guys are looking to play in that space?
So I think I'll use it from the utility standpoint, right? So is that, in order to maintain reliability, we're going to need load following resources, right? So I think we've called them zero emission load following resources, and we see hydrogen as, the potential fuel source to drive, to provide that service that is needed, right? So we see hydrogen as an important part of the future, right? But those technologies aren't available today, right? And so we need the investment, we need the development so that those technologies are available to serve our customers and, meet our zero carbon goals by 2050.
Great, thanks, Chris. Emily, you referenced, one company that you are excited by that you see at the moment. But I'm sure as you walk around, there must be lots of exciting developments and lots of amazing R&D going on within the lab. Are there any other examples you would draw upon around kind of companies or technologies that you're seeing at the moment that really do hold potential to make a difference?
Absolutely. So I'll highlight another one, which I think is an area that we definitely need to be focusing on, and I believe we are focusing on, and it's already resulting in the costs coming down, and that is energy storage. So we've touched on hydrogen as an energy storage solution, but we also need other kinds of battery systems. So we have a company called Form Energy that is developing a super long duration battery system that frankly has the power to revolutionize a grid scale energy storage. And this is moving the capacity, for example, of a lithium battery, which is about 4 hours, up to 6 days continuous electricity with their technology. This company has already raised $120 million to date and has grown from 2 to 70 employees during their time at Greentown Labs. Recently, they secured a first pilot utility scale deal for a 1 megawatt pilot. And last year, they also had graduated from our space and continue to grow their company here in Massachusetts. So that's definitely one of our highlight stories. Another one that's a little bit behind them is Spark Charge, and they're really in the area of EV infrastructure, which is also an important energy storage component, I would say. And this company makes fully portable and modular level 3 charging stations for electric cars. And these provide convenience of charging anytime, anywhere, with the ability to help stranded EV drivers who ran out of range before making it to their destination. And this company has just recently closed a $3.3 million seed round. And you may have caught them. They were on the show that you might catch every now and then if you're into startups, and that is Shark Tank, where they won $1 million for their technology. I think, though, there's another important component to think about, and that is, especially in the light of what's happening in Texas within the last 24 to 48 hours with the winter cold, coupled by the grid's kind of inability to deal with that, is the understanding that we're going to need a variety of grid scale technology, but some of that is also going to be distributed. And so we have a company called Hala Technologies that is doing distributed energy through microgrids. They've developed a platform that makes it easy to connect solar arrays, batteries, and other distributed energy resources to self-managing microgrids. And last year, they announced a demonstration pilot in Louisiana that pairs their product with lithium-ion energy storage plus solar to empower Southwestern Electric Power Company to improve customer resiliency and support peak shaving. So these companies that we work with at Greentown are doing all sorts of different technology developments that have the ability to move us forward faster. And we're always excited when we can find partners who are willing and able to invest in this technology and move it forward in the direction that we know we all need to go.
Thanks, Emily. It sounds good. Chris, do come in.
I wanted to reinforce. I mean, Emily made a good point about the long duration storage. I mean, I think that is a critical component here in the next decade as we're part of this transition, and until those longer term zero emitting resources that are dispatchable, or that until they become a reality, right? That long-term storage is going to be critical. And again, understanding what your ultimate target is, and being able to build the system, right? Because we have a lot of different legacy systems. And so being able to get to that point, I think that long duration storage and advancements in storage are going to be critical, right? Because I think if you look at over time, and so Duke, our utilities, we have pump storage that we built in the 80s, right? And so that is an incredibly valuable asset for our customers. But when it was originally built, it was built to store the excess nuclear energy that was being generated at night, so we didn't have to ramp down the nuclear units, right? So, but as system load grew and over time, and then in the 90s, in the late 90s, we were using it to arbitrage power prices between, different times of the day when we were seeing price spikes. And then now with the penetration of renewables, we're using it to store excess renewables in the middle of the day when you have more renewables than load, right? And so you can do that with that pump storage asset. Batteries, I mean, we've had an experience at one of our battery sites where they changed the operating parameters and it shortened the life of the battery by, a factor of 4. And so with that in mind, I mean, if we're going to make this transition, we have to make sure that we have these different technologies, and storage is going to be key, but we're also making sure that we build it for the application it's going to be used. So just wanted to say, I think that's a critical component that's going to be the bridge to get us to where these technologies are fully developed.
Thanks, Chris. Michael, anything to add on the kind of technologies and the pieces that Emily and Michael have been discussing?
I think broadly it's been covered. I would only say there are probably some other, apart from all of the things around storage and batteries that Emily and Chris have talked about, there's probably some big wins in offshore wind, for instance, with floating wind turbines that will expand massively the areas that can be, or the wind resource that can be exploited in those countries where offshore wind is a major source of energy. So I think that's one to watch, and one which will, if successfully mastered, will continue to drive down, well, A, expand the volume of renewable energy that's available, and B, drive down the cost. I think the other thing, coming back to hydrogen and specific policies, I think we need to get a framework in place which, similar to the renewable incentives of 10, 15 years ago, provides a long-term framework. Say government has a target to drive down the levelized cost of producing hydrogen from renewables, and instigate some kind of tendering process, a staged tendering process to scale up the technology. I think that's something that companies can't do alone. They need government support, whereas there are many things that Emily's talked about where companies alone can innovate, but in partnership with government. And I think we must always remember, most of the technologies that we have developed so far, to some extent, have required a public-private partnership. It depends precisely on the technology, but we need to continue with that process, because it's yielded a lot of fruit over the last 10, 15 years in terms of driving down the cost of carbon-free technologies.
Thanks, Michael, and a really nice point, I think, to wrap us up there. Lots being done, and still lots more to do over the next year, 10 years, 50 years, as we move towards and through this energy transition. Unfortunately, that is all we have time for. There's questions still coming in around various things, one of which asks about how we get the materials and how we ensure that the metals and the processes that we're using for lots of these technologies are net zero, which leads me in nicely to episode 2, which will focus on the industry transition and deep decarbonisation there. But for today's session, I would like to once again thanks to everyone tuned in, everyone listening on demand, and most of all, thank you to Michael, to Emily, and to Chris for joining us today and sharing your views with everyone.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you. See you again soon. Cheers. Bye-bye.